Jason is a professor of environmental sciences, University of Barcelona, the Autonomous University of Barcelona. But Jason is much more important than that, and that is because Jason is Jason Hickel. And Jason Hickel is perhaps, look well at him, is perhaps the new embodiment in anthropology of David Graeber. We of course miss David, but Jason and David have the same sort of public engagement spirit, political, radical, fundamental, a holistic perspective on the world, on capitalism. There's an important difference between the two of them. David was a deep romantic and an idealist. Now I know he is that too. But Jason is beyond what David could actually do and think and imagine, also a real material realist. He goes to the crux of the stuff. So Jason's thinking about economics, not as economics, and capitalism, not just an economic system, but as a type of society, as a type of relations, as a thing that, you know, we all grow up in, that we are in so many ways. I think Jason there surpasses the revolutionariness of David Graeber and comes close to Rosa Luxemburg. His last two books have been sold very broadly, of course not at the scale of David Graeber yet, but you know, David had his Debt book at the height of the worldwide mobilizations of 2011, Occupy Wall Street, etc. Those social movements are at the moment not existing at that scale and not at that radical ambition of claiming and solidarity. So that makes a difference in how the books sell, but they are widely read. They are really greatly written. The way you can just, you know, frame what capitalism is in 5 sentences that makes it clear to everybody that this is not the thing that we always think it is, namely just an economy, that we can switch off and do a post-capitalist economy, but the type of society that requires a real radical rethink is fantastic. Now, I'm so incredibly grateful that you could make it. He comes just out of China. We picked him out of Shanghai. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Don. It's really an honor for me to be here. I definitely don't deserve an introduction like that. I miss David a lot. He taught me a great deal, and really no one can fill his shoes. And certainly neither of us come anywhere close to the great Rosa Luxemburg. My joke about the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation was meant to be a private joke, so please keep it off the record. I'm somewhat paranoid about this microphone. It looks like it's precarious. If problems befall me, please forgive me. So here we go.
Is it well audible in the back?
Yeah, can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
More or less? Okay, good. So normally I'm invited to, well, first of all, sorry, let me say, it's really an honor to be here in Bergen. Thank you to Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for funding the event and also to GRIP for hosting me. I've really enjoyed my time so far. I hear that it's sunny like this all the time, so you're very lucky to live here. So normally I'm invited to speak about degrowth and climate mitigation and eco-socialism, but Don did not invite me to talk about that. Maybe he secretly wanted me to, but I decided that I would use my time to talk about something else entirely, since I rarely get this opportunity. What I always really want to talk about is capitalism and imperialism. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk about the ongoing crises of mass deprivation and underdevelopment in the global south, as well as inequality and ecological breakdown on a world scale. And I'm going to frame this historically and argue that we have to understand these crises as created and perpetuated by capitalism and characterized by imperialist dynamics that underpin capital accumulation. So let me start by trying to describe our current moment. When we look at the world around us, we see an extraordinary paradox. On the one hand, the world economy has absolutely staggering levels of production and output. Economic growth has reached the point where where aggregate resource and energy use is now overshooting 6 planetary boundaries and driving dangerous climate change and ecological breakdown. When it comes to climate objectives, for our entire lives, we've been watching as our ruling classes break promise after promise. Efforts toward decarbonization right now are far too slow, and our political elites are now enjoining us to prepare for the chaos of a planet warmed by 3 degrees, with effects that we know will be devastating to human and non-human life, particularly in the territories of the global south. But at the same time, despite the extraordinary productive capacities of the world economy, billions of people are deprived of access to even basic goods and services. More than 40% of the human population cannot access healthy food. 70% lack access to necessary healthcare. Deprivation is obviously most extreme in the periphery, where, as we're going to see, imperialist appropriation continues to perpetuate poverty and underdevelopment. But it's evident also even in the core, in the richest countries in the world. In the USA, nearly half the population cannot afford healthcare. In the UK, 4.3 million children live in poverty. In the European Union, 95 million people, which is 1 in 5, do not have secure access to things like decent housing and nutritious food. Think about this. These problems are presented to us as difficult and intractable, but in fact, they are not. They can be solved quickly and easily. We have more than enough productive capacity to do it, but our current economic system is fundamentally incapable of achieving this. These are basic contradictions of capitalism, which our ruling classes cannot resolve while keeping the system intact. And their obvious failure to do so is now giving rise to extraordinary social upheaval and far-right resurgence. To make matters worse, the US and its allies have been ramping up aggression against China while also actively supporting genocidal crimes in Palestine in the face of overwhelming international condemnation and in clear violation of established international law. To borrow the words of Antonio Gramsci, now is the time of monsters. So why is all this happening, and what needs to be done? I'm going to argue that the ecological crisis and the crisis of mass deprivation and underdevelopment and dynamics of geopolitical violence are all structural effects of the capitalist world economy and are best understood through the lens of world system analysis. But let me start with a few important observations about the nature of capitalism so that we're all on the same page analytically. When people hear the word capitalism, they often think of things like businesses and markets and trade, with private individuals voluntarily producing and exchanging things in a sort of fair and neutral way. This is the narrative that prevails in economic textbooks and in popular media. It's a narrative of innocence. Capitalism is represented as a sort of generic, natural kind of economy. Who could possibly be against it? But of course, this story is highly inaccurate. Businesses, markets, and trade existed for thousands of years before capitalism and have taken many different forms. Capitalism is only about 500 years old and is distinguished by several key features which are relevant for our purposes here. First, it is fundamentally undemocratic. Now, this may seem a bit strange to say, because obviously many of us live in democratic political systems where we get to elect our public officials from time to time, even if we acknowledge that these systems are inadequate and corrupt. But when it comes to the economic system, the system of production, not even a pretense of democracy exists. Production is controlled overwhelmingly by capital, the major financial firms, the commercial banks, the large corporations, and the 1% who own the majority of investable assets. They are the ones who decide what to produce, how to use our collective labor and our planet's resources, and who gets the benefit. And this brings us to a second defining feature of capitalism. For capital, the purpose of production, the purpose of mobilizing all of our labor and resources to produce stuff, is not in fact to meet human needs or to achieve social progress, much less to accomplish any ecological goals. The purpose is to maximize and accumulate profit. That is the overriding objective. Indeed, crucially, capital only invests in production if it is profitable to do so, and does not produce things if it is not profitable to do so, regardless of how necessary that production may be. So this is known as the capitalist law of value that determines production. Now, to sustain a process of perpetual accumulation, capital requires an ever-increasing quantity of inputs, and at the lowest possible price, cheap labor and cheap nature. But this entails, as you can imagine, very severe contradictions. If you intensify the exploitation of your domestic working classes, you will eventually face a revolution. And if you intensify the exploitation of your domestic resources, you will eventually undermine the ecological basis on which all of production depends. This cannot continue for very long within a bounded economy. Capitalism requires some kind of outside, an external frontier, where it can exploit labor and nature with impunity, where it can externalize social and ecological costs, and where rebellions can be contained and destroyed with as much force as necessary. Thus, we have a third key feature of capitalism. Capitalism requires an imperial arrangement in order to stabilize accumulation, to use the words of the Indian economist Utsa Patnaik. Imperialism is not a side gig, not a mistake committed by an over-greedy ruling class. It is a structurally necessary feature of capitalism. Capitalism does not resolve its contradictions. It simply externalizes them. So at the very moment of the rise of capitalism in Western Europe during the long 16th century, European imperialism gets underway. There's no temporal or analytical distinction between these two moments. They are one and the same projects. The rise of capitalism in Western Europe, as we know, relied utterly on the appropriation of resources from the colonies and on the use of enslaved and indentured labor on a massive scale. Silver was plundered from the Andes, obtained virtually for free, and enabled European states to purchase enormous quantities of land-based goods from the East, again, effectively for free. This allowed them to shift their labor away from agriculture and into industrial manufacturing, and develop monopoly power in that sector, which is a privilege that, of course, no other region in the world enjoyed. Sugar. Sugar provided a source of cheap calories that could be fed to Europe's working classes, thus cheapening their subsistence costs and enabling capitalists to pay them lower wages. And of course, sugar was only cheap, not naturally, but because it was obtained from land stolen from indigenous Americans and produced with the labor of enslaved Africans. Cotton was obtained in the same way. The key raw material of England's Industrial Revolution did not grow in England, or anywhere in Europe for that matter. And this is before we get to the rubber, to the gold, the timber, the grain, and the countless other resources appropriated from Asia, Africa, and the Americas, an extraordinary flow of wealth that enabled the economic rise of the imperialist states, that enabled their military developments, and which was used to fund the rapid industrialization of the European settler colonies. Now, of course, crucially, no country in the global south or elsewhere is destined to be a supplier of cheap labor and raw materials. This is not some natural so-called comparative advantage. This arrangement had to be forcibly instituted. In 1840, the chairman of the East India and China Association boasted to the English Parliament, and I quote his words, "This company has succeeded in converting India from a manufacturing country into a country exporting raw produce." Not only in India, but across the global south, indigenous industries had to be destroyed, subsistence economies had to be ripped up, the considerable productive capacities of the global south, their land, their resources, their factories, their labor, had to be reorganized away from servicing local human needs and developments in order to service consumption and accumulation in the core. Indeed, this was the central objective of the colonial projects. How was it done? One mechanism was to dispossess people and make them dependent on wage work in colonial industries. Another was to impose taxes in a colonial currency that people do not have, and therefore which can only be obtained by producing things for the colonizer or by working for them to earn those wages. This is a crucial point that I'm going to return to later. Whoever controls the issuance of currency controls what gets produced. And of course, the colonizers kept prices and wages as low as possible. So with these mechanisms, colonized populations were made to increase their total production, but also had their consumption compressed in order to make their output, right, available for imperial appropriation. So the consequences of this arrangement were devastating. And here I want to directly confront the propaganda that seeks to claim otherwise. Over the past several years, a new narrative has emerged asserting that extreme poverty, which is a condition of absolute deprivation, defined by an inability to access basic food, shelter, clothing, and fuel, was the natural condition of humanity for all of human history before capitalism arose and brought social progress. Now, this narrative relies in large part on a graph created by the late World Bank economist Martin Ravellian and popularized by Steven Pinker in his best-selling book, Enlightenment Now. The graph shows extreme poverty declining from a starting point of 90% in 1820. Now, measuring the poverty rate requires direct data on household consumption, which generally does not exist prior to about 1980. To get around this problem, Ravellian relied on historical GDP growth rates as a proxy for changes in household consumption. The problem is that GDP data does not tell us anything about what ordinary people were actually able to consume. So think, if you kick people off the land, destroy their subsistence crops, and install banana plantations in their place, GDP may increase, right, this is a measure of total market production, may increase even while people's access to food and livelihoods may be severely constrained. So in a recent paper for World Development, led by Dylan Sullivan, we assessed this prevailing narrative against historical data on human height, mortality rates, and real wages with respect to the cost of subsistence since the 16th century, using the temporal framework provided by world system historians. We found several interesting things that I want to share with you. First, historical wage data indicates that even unskilled laborers were generally capable of meeting subsistence requirements under normal conditions, even in pre-industrial contexts. Extreme poverty was not a normal condition. It generally only arose during periods of severe dislocation, such as famines, wars, and dispossession, which became institutionalized under colonialism. Second, we found that the rise of capitalism in Western Europe and then the gradual incorporation of the rest of the world's regions into the capitalist world system through the colonial projects was associated with a remarkable decline in wages to below subsistence, a decline in human stature indicating severe nutritional crisis, and an increase in mortality rates. In other words, during the consolidation of the capitalist world economy, progress on social outcomes stalled and reversed. This is clear in all of the world regions that we assessed, but let me take India as an example. And I normally pick this because I tend to speak to British audiences. So in India, we do, in fact, have direct data on household consumption provided by the historian Robert Allen. Allen's data shows that extreme poverty was only about 10% in the pre-colonial period, and then increased under British rule to well over 50%. Indian real wages declined under the British, reaching a nadir in the 19th century at the height of the British Raj, and colonizers appropriated Indian agricultural output and food grains to the point of inducing, as we know, several mass famines. In the late 19th century, again, the height of the British colonial project, India suffered a mass mortality crisis of astonishing proportions. Population censuses carried out by the colonial regime, beginning in the 1880s, reveal that the death rate increased from 37 per 1,000 people in that decade to 44 per 1,000 people in the 1910s. If we take the 1880s figure as the baseline mortality rate, this means that 50 million souls, 50 million excess deaths occurred during the aegis of British colonialism between 1891 to 1920. This is one of the largest policy-induced mortality crises in human history, an unspeakable crime against humanity that the British ruling classes have never faced up to. The establishment of the capitalist world economy was an extraordinarily violent process. How do you manage to justify mass displacement, mass enslavement, and genocides perpetrated on several continents? What could possibly provide cover for these crimes? The answer is race. It was during this very period that European elites developed theories of white supremacy and racial hierarchy in order to dehumanize the majority world population, hiving them off from the realm of rights, and thus to justify unprecedented levels of exploitation and bloodshed in the periphery. Racism, like imperialism itself, is not a sideshow to capitalism, but a structurally necessary feature of it. It is not a standalone problem, one that can be addressed with a few liberal reforms here and there. It has always been central to the world system, and it remains that way today. Now, we found that progress on key social indicators did, of course, eventually occur. After all, look at us now. But it happened much later. In the core regions of Northwest Europe, welfare standards only began to improve in the 1880s, around 4 centuries after the emergence of capitalism. This corresponds with the rise of organized labor and the movements for democracy and socialism, which sought to reclaim production and organize it more around meeting human needs, ensuring access to food, safe housing, sanitation systems, healthcare and education, in the face of, I should add, extraordinary resistance from the capitalist class. Progress accelerated further after the Russian Revolution and other socialist revolutions in the periphery, which forced capitalists in Western Europe to make major concessions to the working classes in their own territories, or else face the real prospects of revolution, which came to the brink of occurring in Germany and several other European countries. In other words, social progress has not been handed down to us by capital. It has been won by radical social movements. Okay. In the periphery, progress in social welfare did not occur until later still, in the early 20th century, coinciding exactly with the rise of the radical anti-colonial movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And this is where we begin to reach the crux of my argument. Organized anti-colonial resistance and armed liberation struggles, including in Ireland, India, Vietnam, Cuba, China, Algeria, Angola, etc., mounted very serious opposition to the European colonizers. And by the middle of the 20th century, they succeeded. This is not a small accomplishment. The poorest and most exploited people on the planet succeeded in overcoming the most powerful imperial forces in history. And upon achieving political liberation, they immediately set out pursuing strategies of economic sovereignty. Most of these movements were inspired in some way by socialist and communist ideas, which provided a blueprint for reclaiming national control over productive capacities and organizing them around human needs and development objectives. Used land reform to reclaim territories from their colonizers. They nationalized key resources like oil and minerals to command fairer prices in the world economy. They used industrial policy to develop their own national industries. They used capital controls to keep profits onshore. And they used planning to build public services and to develop necessary industrial capacities. So an important point which I think is underappreciated is that many of these movements were directly inspired by the Russian Revolution, right? So prior to 1917, Russia was a low-wage agrarian hinterland, exporting cheap raw materials to Western Europe. In fact, the Russian finance minister, Sergei Witte, himself stated, and I quote, "The economic relations of Russia with Western Europe are fully comparable," he said, "to the relations of the colonial countries with their metropolis." End quote. The Russian Revolution, we must understand, was an anti-colonial revolution which sought to escape the imperial arrangement and gain sovereign control over production. Now, whatever we might say about Soviet Russia, and clearly there are many critiques to be made, no one could deny that their development strategy worked. Within just 2 decades, they went from being an agrarian hinterland to being a major industrial power. They played a decisive role in World War II, and shortly thereafter, they achieved several major landmarks in aerospace engineering, including putting the first person into space. This development trajectory has never been replicated to that scale. And they achieved these things because they understood the capitalist law of value. Capital only invests in development when it is profitable to do so, right? In the periphery, this presents a real problem because it is generally more profitable to capital to exploit cheap labor within global supply chains than it is to invest in technology and industrial development. So countries that rely on capital to drive investments end up languishing in conditions of underdevelopment. If you want real development, you need some mechanism for directly mobilizing production to achieve development objectives. So public finance, industrial policy, and economic planning. The story of Soviet Russia proves that underdevelopment is not some impossible problem to solve. Indeed, it can be overcome very quickly. And this fact was recognized by every single government in the global south that sought to achieve economic liberation. Several countries in the south incorporated socialist strategies in the mid-20th century. Others took a more mixed approach, right? Relying on industrial policy to guide private capital. But for all of them, land reform, nationalization, public finance, and public planning were central. And this approach succeeded at raising incomes and improving welfare. It launched a real development miracle with rapid improvements in social indicators and average per capita growth rates of 3.2% during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That's higher than what the West achieved during its own industrial revolution. For some reason, this achievement and the strategies that enabled it have been largely forgotten in contemporary development discourse. Okay, but this movement, here's the problem. This movement toward economic sovereignty in the global south posed an extraordinary threat to the core states, as it was cutting off their access to cheap labor and resources that they had relied on for centuries. Sovereign development in the south meant that southern countries were producing and consuming more for themselves, which in turn meant that those resources were no longer cheaply available for the core. And this manifests as a rising supply price, right? Destabilizing profits, destabilizing the imperial arrangements, and making capital accumulation in the core very difficult to sustain, especially because Western wages were also rising at the same time, thanks to the power of organized labor. So capitalism faced a crisis, culminating in the 1970s, because it cannot function under conditions of decolonization and worker justice. So the governments in the core faced a fork in the road. They could either accept economic sovereignty in the global south and decent wages at home, abandon capital accumulation, and shift to a post-capitalist economy. Or they could try to maintain capital accumulation by destroying the labor movement and somehow restoring the basic structure of the imperial arrangement. And they opted hard for the latter. Imperialist states responded to the anti-colonial movement in two ways. First, they intervened militarily to depose anti-colonial leaders. The list here is long and includes several figures that are household names in the global south and which all of us should know. Does anybody know this guy? This is Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, deposed in 1953 by a Western-backed coup. This is Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, deposed in 1954 by a Western-backed coup. This is Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, deposed in 1961 by a Western-backed coup. João Goulart in Brazil, deposed in 1964 by a Western-backed coup. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, deposed in 1966 by a Western-backed coup. Sukarno in Indonesia, deposed in 1967 by a Western-backed coup. And of course, the one that most people actually do know, Salvador Allende in Chile, deposed in 1973 by a Western-backed coup. And there were many others who were unseated and replaced with right-wing dictators more amenable to Western economic interests, and who rolled back the socialist and developmentalist reforms of the progressive era. According to a recent study, using official records, the US conducted no fewer than 70 regime change operations in global south countries during this period. Beacons of democracy. This violence is often packaged under the banner of the Cold War as a campaign to destroy socialism. But casting it as a purely ideological battle misses the real material stakes of this history. Western powers went after socialist movements because they knew that socialism would enable the South to regain control over their own productive capacities, which would undermine the imperial arrangement on which capitalism depends, and thus the desperate incineration of countries like Vietnam and North Korea. But Western powers didn't only attack the socialist movements. They went after anyone who pursued economic sovereignty, and they did it with equal brutality. This explains why they targeted Brazil, Guatemala, the DRC, and many other explicitly non-aligned countries that had developmentalist governments. The Cold War was not about defeating socialism as such. It was a campaign to destroy economic sovereignty in the periphery. Now, it's worth pausing here for a moment, I think, to make a brief but I think important point about Israel. Western support for the Zionist project is actually part of this history. Key figures in the European ruling classes were willing to support a settler colony in the Middle East because they saw this as a way to establish an outpost in a region where they had substantial claims to oil and other resources that they wanted to maintain. So the idea here is that the US started to support the Zionist projects in the 1960s and invested heavily in the Israeli arms industry with the explicit intention of using Israel as a staging ground for counter-revolutionary interventions against socialist and national liberation struggles in North Africa and the Middle East, right, at what they considered to be the hinge of three continents. The US could not accept the prospect of sovereign developments in that region. Liberation movements had to be crushed, and they used Israel to do this, and this is very well documented. Interestingly, they used South Africa in exactly the same way, right? The key reason that Western powers supported the apartheid regime in South Africa, also against overwhelming international condemnation, was because it served as a highly militarized Western colonial outpost. It was geared up to run counterinsurgency operations in the region, right? Not just within South Africa itself, but also in Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, the DRC, et cetera, et cetera. I think this point is crucial to understanding the current moment, actually, because people are often dumbfounded about US support for Israel, right? Like the Biden administration, for example. Willing to support obvious war crimes, even in the face of widespread popular discontents, including from US citizens, right? To the point of totally debasing international law. Like, why do it? Even to the point of risking, the re-election. People tend to fall back on narratives about the power of AIPAC in US elections, which is interesting, but I think inadequate. The fact is that it is 100% in the interests of the US ruling class to shore up their military proxy in the Middle East at virtually any cost to maintain the imperial arrangement, right? It's the very same reason that Reagan and Thatcher went all in for the apartheid regime in South Africa. That's just part of the story. I think that the crucial thing is that northern states are intervening militarily against the liberation movements. And yet, crucially, despite these setbacks, the global south was still rising. The non-aligned movement formed the G77 to cooperate in the United Nations, where they held a democratic majority. And in 1974, they passed the new international economic order, the NIEO, establishing the principles of national economic sovereignty, which is a massive win for the southern states. Western governments at this time were scrambling for a way to contain this insurgent South. And while the ink had barely dried on the NIEO, they got it with the Volcker shock. In 1980, Paul Volcker, the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, increased interest rates dramatically to the point of over 20%. This triggered a recession in the US economy, which was intentional to break the back of organized labor in the US. But it also triggered a debt crisis across the global south. The US then leveraged this crisis by using the World Bank and the IMF to impose structural adjustment programs on developing countries across the region. So structural adjustment forced governments to privatize public industries, privatize their resources, cut public services, abolish industrial policy, and cut protections on labor and the environment, reversing the policies of the anti-colonial era in one fell swoop. So this was the sharp edge of neoliberal reform, imposed more viciously on the global south than ever it was in the USA or Britain. And I think this is an important point. These days, people use the term neoliberalism, I think, in very imprecise ways. It's crucial to understand the geopolitical history here. The neoliberal turn occurred specifically as a response to the success of the anti-colonial movement, with the objective of attacking economic sovereignty in the South and re-cheapening labor and resources. Neoliberalism was the mechanism for restoring the imperial arrangement. So it was like a coup. During the 80s and 90s, power over macroeconomic policy was shifted from the parliaments of the South to bankers and technocrats in Washington, New York, and London. The brief era of economic independence in the South was over. And I should note that one of the key provisions of structural adjustment was that it curtailed the ability of states to issue national currency, to use public finance. So if you want to finance production, you have to rely on capital. You have to get foreign currency by ramping up exports to the core, or you have to attract foreign investments. And remember, whoever controls currency determines production. So dependence on foreign currency or foreign investment means that production is organized in the South around the interests of foreign capital. So by restoring the imperial arrangements, structural adjustment rescued capitalism in the core. It restored the rate of corporate profit. It rescued northern growth, which had been flagging in the 1970s. And it allowed for European governments to sustain a reasonable bargain with their working classes while still maintaining capital accumulation, preserving the basic formula of social democracy. For the global South, however, the consequences were very severe. So have a look at this graph. This shows national income per capita in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, indexed to 2005. We see a dramatic increase in income and consumption through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, followed by a staggering collapse during the neoliberal period. 30 years of decline and stagnation. Now note that these economies continued to increase production during this period. But because prices were cheapened, their income was deflated, okay? So Southerners were made to consume less in order to make resources more easily available for the core. And this is very evident in physical input-output tables. Now, there's an interesting point that I think is worth making here briefly. There are some liberal progressives, for example, Paul Krugman, who like to think of neoliberalism as the problem. And they call for a return to the more humane version of capitalism that preceded it. But neoliberalism was not some kind of mistake. It was imposed because it was necessary to resolve the crisis of capital accumulation in the face of an insurgent South. It was necessary for the continuation of capitalism. Now, there were exceptions, of course, but they prove the rule. People like to point to South Korea and Taiwan as examples of successful capitalist developments in the periphery, right? But the reality is that the US and its allies actively supported these states in using state-led industrial policy, precisely the approach that they denied to the rest of the global South. Why? Because they wanted to build these states up as a cordon sanitaire around revolutionary China. The US has 62 military bases in South Korea alone, among more than 200 military bases that encircle China, including in South Korea, Camp Humphreys, which is the largest overseas military base in the world. So structural adjustment destroyed the South's attempts to achieve sovereign industrialization and reestablished them as suppliers of cheap raw materials, but this time also as manufacturers of light industrial goods in subordinate positions within global supply chains that are dominated by northern firms. So things like clothing and parts and consumer technologies. While northern firms, for their part, turn to monopolizing intellectual property and high-tech production processes, okay, maintaining the South's dependence on those things. But structural adjustment also depressed wages and prices in the global South. And this has very severe implications when it comes to international trade. Now, the key thing to understand here is that all imports must be paid for with exports, okay? So systematic price inequalities mean that for every unit of embodied labor and materials that the South imports from the North, it then has to export many more units to pay for that. And this leads to a hidden transfer of value that flows from the South to the North. It's hidden because it looks like there's a monetary balance of trade, right? But in reality, the South is sending a net transfer of real value to the global North. This enriches the core, but it drains the periphery of resources that are necessary for development. Global South economists like Samir Amin and Roy Marumarini described this as unequal exchange. They argued that this dynamic enables a continuation of imperialist appropriation from the periphery, even in the absence of colonial occupation. So today we can see this in empirical data, using large, environmentally extended multi-regional input-output tables that allow us to trace flows of embodied land and labor and resources around the world. And using these models, in several recent papers with my colleagues, we've quantified the scale of net transfers from the south to the north since the 1990s. So I'm going to show you some of the results here. So first, have a look at this chart, which shows the South's imports of embodied labor from the global north in light blue at the top, compared to the South's exports of embodied labor in dark blue at the bottom. For every unit that the South imports, they have to export at least 10 times as much. This is largely because Southern wages are massively compressed compared to Northern wages. Southern workers earn about 90% less than Northern workers for work of the same skill in the same sector. In fact, the inequalities are so extreme that highly skilled workers in the global South, like engineers and scientists, are paid 68% less than low-skilled labor in the global North. These are systematic inequalities, political artifacts of the capitalist world economy, and a major driver of unequal exchange. And we also see the exact same systematic trade imbalances when it comes to embodied materials, right? Embodied lands, and embodied energy. So this unequal exchange leads to truly massive net transfers of value from south to north. In the final year of data, we see the following. A net south-north flow of 12 billion tons of embodied materials and 21 exajoules of embodied energy. Now, these are huge figures that most of us cannot comprehend. So I'm going to put them in perspective. According to recent research, this quantity of materials and energy would be enough to provide infrastructure and supplies to provision what we call DLS, or decent living standards, for everyone. Universal healthcare, education, modern housing, sanitation, electricity, heating and cooling systems, induction stoves, refrigerators, freezers, washing machines, public transit, computers, and mobile phones for the entire population of the global south. But instead, it is siphoned away for consumption and accumulation in the core. A net flow of 820 million hectares of embodied land. To put this in perspective, this is twice the size of India. That amount of land could be used for producing nutritious food for up to 6 billion people, but instead is used to produce things like sugar for Coca-Cola and beef for McDonald's, consumed in the imperial core. And then finally, 826 billion hours of embodied labor, which is more than the total annual embodied labor, total annual labor rendered by the entire workforces of the US and the European Union combined. That labor, think about this. That labor could be mobilized to staff hospitals and schools in the global south and produce food and goods for local needs, but instead it is used to churn out a net flow of tech gadgets and fast fashion for northern corporations. We calculated that if this net appropriated labor was paid at prevailing northern wages for equal work of equal skill, it would cost 16.9 trillion euros per year. So there are a couple of things to notice here. First, these results reveal that the high levels of consumption and economic growth in the core rely utterly on net appropriation from the south, today just as much as during the colonial era. In the case of materials and labor, on average around half of total consumption in the core, half, is net appropriated from the south. And it's even higher in the Scandinavian countries. So think about what this means. It means that in the absence of imperialism, the core would have to reduce their consumption by 50%. Alternatively, if they wanted to maintain their existing consumption, they would have to double their labor and material extraction, which would clearly not be possible because it would trigger massive social resistance and ecological damage. In other words, the high levels of consumption in the core are only possible because of appropriation from the south. It also means that while the north benefits from the extra consumption, the social and ecological costs are effectively externalized to the global south. That's where the damage happens. Not primarily in England or in the green hills of Norway, but in the Congo, in Indonesia, in Brazil. This is the core mechanism that creates environmental injustice. Second, The data on unequal exchange helps us to understand the persistence of global inequality. So this graph shows real GDP per capita in the core versus all peripheral regions since 1960. Now, for ages, the mainstream development narrative has tried to convince us that if given enough time, the global south will gradually, catch up to the global north through capitalist development. But this is not happening. The core periphery income gap is bigger than ever before, including in relative terms. And the reason is because catch-up developments cannot happen within a system that is predicated on imperialist appropriation and net south-north flows. Finally, it helps us to understand the persistence of mass poverty and underdevelopment in the global south. The global south is impoverished, not because it is somehow naturally poor, but because its income is compressed and its productive capacities are drained to support developments in the core. Now, I want to zoom in on this question of poverty a little bit more. The conventional way of measuring extreme poverty was developed by the World Bank, and it involves determining the number of people who live on less than $1.90 per day in 2011 purchasing power parity. In other words, equivalent to what could be purchased in the United States with $1.90 in the year 2011. According to this method, we see that the extreme poverty rate was a staggering 43% in 1981, and then declined dramatically to about 9% just prior to the pandemic. Most of you are probably familiar with this data. These figures have been widely circulated and recruited to claim that neoliberal capitalism has delivered extraordinary progress against poverty. But a growing body of literature argues that the World Bank's PPP-based method suffers from very major limitations, as it does not account for the actual cost of meeting basic needs in any given context, right? So in recent years, scholars have developed a more robust method for measuring extreme poverty by comparing people's incomes to the prices of essential goods in each country, specifically food, shelter, clothing, and fuel, right? So this approach is known as the basic needs poverty line, and it more accurately represents what the original concept of extreme poverty was intended to measure. So using this approach, we can see that extreme poverty increased dramatically during the period of forced liberalization in the 1990s. The graph on the left shows the percentage of people in extreme poverty, while on the right we see the total number of people in extreme poverty. This immiseration occurred primarily because liberalization slashed public provisioning systems, slashed subsidies and price controls, leading to an increase in the prices of essential goods and services, and therefore, again, imposing income deflation on the working classes. Now, the story gets even more interesting when we look at this data broken down by political economic system. So this graph shows extreme poverty in the capitalist states in the periphery and the semi-periphery versus their socialist counterparts. Several crucial things emerge. First, we see that the socialist countries in the 1980s managed to keep extreme poverty very low, on average less than about 5%. In fact, in many countries it was close to zero. By contrast, the capitalist states had extreme poverty rates that were on average about 10 times higher. The second point is that the destruction of socialism in 1990, as we can see, caused an absolutely massive spike in extreme poverty in those regions. It was among the most rapid and dramatic processes of immiseration in the historical record. Now, the socialist countries' strong performance on poverty during the 1980s is confirmed by other key social indicators. So we compared socialist versus capitalist countries in the periphery at any given level of development, right? GDP per capita, looking at 15 indicators, including infant mortality, life expectancy, healthcare systems, education, et cetera, et cetera. And we found that socialist states outperformed the capitalist states in virtually all direct comparisons. And it also bears mentioning, I think, that the socialist states performed dramatically better on the three key indicators of gender inequality that are available: labor force participation, share of labor income, and representation in parliaments. Women's share of legislative seats was on average about 5 times higher in the socialist countries. So as the economist Amartya Sen remarked in his 1981 study of health and literary achievements around the world, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that communism is good for poverty removal. And Sen was particularly fascinated with the dramatic mortality differences between China and India, pointing out that India suffered more than 31 million excess deaths during the 1970s, compared to the mortality rate in China, deaths that could have been prevented with simple policies to ensure universal access to food and healthcare. So it's remarkable to me how this data has almost been completely ignored by international development scholars today. Poverty is presented to us as this intractable problem that's difficult to solve and takes a very long time. But many of the socialist countries were able to eliminate extreme poverty 4 decades ago, right? Even at very low levels of economic development. And they did it very simply by organizing production to ensure universal access to food, housing, and healthcare and education, okay? It's really not rocket science. Decommodified public provisioning and price controls are extremely effective tools when it comes to removing poverty. But let me say this. Ending extreme poverty should not be our benchmark for progress. Remember, we've established that extreme poverty was historically uncommon under normal conditions and only arose in times of severe social dislocation, okay? So the crucial implication of this finding is that extreme poverty should never exist, period. And the fact that nearly 20% of humanity lives in extreme poverty today, higher than the poverty rate in pre-colonial India, is a profound indictment of our economic system. It's a sign that capitalism has institutionalized severe social dislocation. Indeed, instead of measuring progress according to extreme poverty, we should aim to ensure much higher standards of living, such as the DLS basket that I mentioned earlier. So again, decent living standards. Universal access to stoves, refrigerators, freezers, washing machines, public transit, computers, mobile phones, et cetera, et cetera. These things are essential and should be available to everybody. And yet deprivation on this measure is staggering. 3 billion people do not have access to a clean cooking stove. 4 billion people do not have safely managed sanitation facilities. 5 billion people do not have access to essential healthcare services. In low and middle income countries, around 94% of those populations are deprived on at least one core indicator of decent living. Now, this is not because there is a deficit of productive capacity. No, we have massive productive capacity, and these goods can be provided for everyone on the planet, and quickly, with a small share of it. Researchers in our group have demonstrated that DLS could be extended to 8.5 billion people with only 30% of the energy and materials that the global economy presently uses, if that was the objective, right? The problem is the capitalist law of value. Under capitalism, our productive capacity is mobilized primarily around what is profitable to capital, rather than what is necessary for human needs and well-being. So we get massive investment in producing things like fossil fuels and SUVs and fast fashion and industrial beef and cruise ships and weapons. But we have chronic shortages of necessary things like renewable energy, public transit, and regenerative agriculture, because these things are less profitable to capital or not profitable at all. This is the reason for the paradox that I identified at the beginning. This is why we have massive overuse of resources in the world economy to the point of driving ecological breakdown, and yet still suffer massive human deprivation. It's because capitalism perpetrates an extraordinary misallocation of labor and production. If the existing arrangement appears unable to end extreme poverty, it certainly shows no signs of ever delivering decent living standards for all. Like, what year will that happen in, right? And imperialist dynamics in the world economy appear actively to prevent it. So this is not an acceptable situation. Capitalism, crucially, also shows no signs of solving the climate crisis. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the climate crisis cannot be solved within capitalism. And this is true for 2 key reasons. First, note that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. For a long time, economists promised that this would deliver a quick transition, but it's not happening. And the reason is because capital does not make investments on the basis of the sale price. It makes investments on the basis of profits. Fossil fuels are about 3 times more profitable than renewables. So over the past several years, we're seeing that capital is continuing to plow finance into fossil fuels, even while the world burns around us. Major investment firms have in fact abandoned their commitments to green transition, acknowledging that green technologies are not profitable enough. I think this is a clarifying moment for us, right? We cannot rely on capital to deliver the green transition. And the second problem is this. In order for high-income countries to decarbonize fast enough to stay within their fair shares of the Paris-compliant carbon budget, they need to reduce total energy use. Some of this can be achieved through efficiency improvements, yes, for sure, but it also requires actively scaling down unnecessary forms of production, right? SUVs, fast fashion, mansions, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, degrowth. But of course, capital will never voluntarily degrow production in any industry, especially if that industry is profitable. So whether we're trying to increase production of necessary things or decrease production of unnecessary things, the only way to achieve an eco-social transformation is to overcome the capitalist law of value. So what does this mean? It means economic democracy. The ecological crisis, like the crisis of underdevelopment and human deprivation, is ultimately a problem of the production system. Solving it is going to require achieving democratic control over the means of production, our labor and our planet's resources, and organizing them around the double objective of well-being and ecology. In other words, democratic eco-socialism. And we need to start building the political movements that are necessary to get us there. Otherwise, I think we're in trouble. So what does this look like in practical terms? In my work, I've tried to describe how an eco-socialist transformation can be achieved in the global north. I'm not going to repeat what that looks like here, but I'm going to say this because it's important. If we want to achieve sufficiently rapid decarbonization, there's one thing that we must implement with real urgency, and that is a credit guidance framework. So in our existing economy, commercial banks allocate credit, and credit facilitates production. Now, right now, the banks, of course, invest in whatever's most profitable, right? Regardless of whether it's harmful or beneficial. A credit guidance framework simply imposes rules on commercial banks to limit finance to fossil fuels and other damaging industries, therefore reducing production in them, while steering investment instead toward renewables and other necessary forms of production. This is how you subordinate finance to democratically ratified objectives. This is a basic principle of industrial policy. It is essential to accelerating the green transition, and we must embrace it. We also need public finance mechanisms that can directly fund and carry out necessary works, right? Building renewable energy capacity, establishing public transit systems, insulating homes, restoring ecosystems, things that are necessary and urgent, but which capital does not do because it's not profitable. So doing this is not optional. It's existentially imperative. We must overcome the inertia of capital. Now, what about the global south? And I'm closing with this. The fundamental point is that southern governments need to find ways to escape the imperial arrangement. They need to achieve the second stage of decolonization. They need to delink from imperial capital, reclaim control over their national productive capacities, and reorganize them around meeting human needs and achieving national development. Remember, the global south is not poor. It's rich. It's endowed with vast tracts of fertile lands, abundant labor, and extraordinary resources. The problem is that they do not have sovereign control over these capacities. So how can they achieve this? The first step is to deploy public finance. Any government that issues its own national currency can use it to finance production of anything that is needed, so long as the labor and materials are purchasable in that currency. This can be used to fund necessary public works, building houses, schools, clinics, sanitation systems, public services, regenerative agriculture, and so on. The same strategy can be used to train and hire the hundreds of millions of people who are currently left languishing in conditions of mass unemployment and exclusion because capital does not find it profitable to use their labor. This is a massive productive capacity that under capitalism is left totally underutilized. Think of the power of this labor force. Instead of waiting around hoping that capital will somehow, someday employ these people, states can employ them directly to achieve national development objectives. And of course, it's necessary to implement industrial policy and planning using the very strategies that we know were successful in the 20th century to guide production towards building a sovereign industrial base. Of course, we have to recognize all of this is effectively precluded under the conditions of structural adjustment and Western financial institutions, which limit public finance and prohibit industrial policy. But you have to do it anyhow. You break the rules. They will try to punish you, but you can protect yourself by reducing dependence on imports from the core and on core currencies, substituting imports with domestic production where possible, and obtaining them through south-south trade and swap lines outside of core currencies, which is now beginning to happen. With this approach, unemployment and poverty can be ended permanently, and social and ecological crises, ecological goals can be achieved and quickly. And I will add, an anti-colonial transformation along these lines in the South, which abolishes the imperial arrangement, would effectively force a post-capitalist transition in the global North. Of course, it is critically important to guard against imperialist backlash. As we know all too well, the core states are more than willing to use genocidal violence against liberation movements. South-South solidarity and regional cooperation are absolutely essential here. And as we've learned recently from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, if you're going to make a break for it, you need to establish defense alliances to increase your deterrence. By way of conclusion, let me say this. The crises that we face in our current moments are existential. The solutions currently proposed by our leaders are obviously inadequate to the task. We urgently need to build political movements that are capable of achieving real eco-social transformation. But one thing is for certain. If our theory of revolutionary change does not center Southern peasants and workers and Southern liberation struggles as primary agents of world historical transformation, then I think we're fundamentally missing the point. Thank you very much.
Well, I would say that Rosa Luxemburg can be content. Jason, come back, because we have to in-house discuss it for you. Anwasha Dutta from CMI. Anwasha has a PhD from Ghent University. She works on conflict and development, political ecology, resource extraction, livelihoods, forest conservation, specialization South Asia. Anwasha, word's yours.
Thank you so much, Don, for this invitation, and what an honor to be here. Jason, who I call the Tom Cruise of anthropology. Having said that, this was, it's so much to process, like the time that we are in today's world. These are compounded challenges of war, of ecological destruction, of poverty that Jason touched upon. But I will start with something very personal. Feminists have long said that the personal is political. And I start here because I gave birth just 2 months ago, and I almost died. And it's still possible to die in childbirth because 260,000 women died during pregnancy and childbirth in 2023. And that's the reality that we live in today. Approximately 92% of all maternal deaths occurred in low and lower middle income countries. And again, we cannot delineate these health figures from whatever Jason's been talked about, because maternal health is intrinsically linked to poverty and inequality. I did not die. Of course, I had to be here to bash capitalism, but also because I had access to high-quality healthcare. I live in Norway, where within minutes of when I was losing blood and everything was going wrong, I could be rushed into surgery and treated by a full team of medical experts. 20 experts leading to this colonial body. Yeah, I made it. Now, this is also the part where, in the spirit of those very heartfelt land acknowledgements you hear in Canada and Australia, I feel compelled to acknowledge that I live and work in a petrostate. Yes, Norway. And my life and my research is made possible, at least in part, by the profits of fossil fuel. And these are these inherent contradictions that we live in today, that so many of us, we are against privilege, but we are living that privilege in our daily life. So how do we kill privilege? By living through privilege in our everyday. And it is this quest to resolve this contradiction between our identities as enemy of privilege, and in reality, educationally, culturally, and economically, we have these different degrees and layers of privilege. Now, as some of you might be aware of a recent study by Sarah Schongart and colleagues that further nuanced the evidence. So we know that wealthy individuals have a higher carbon footprint, and they pointed out that the world's wealthiest 10% are responsible for 2/3 of observed global warming since 1990. But it's not true that all these wealthy individuals only reside in the global north, because this is an important finding, because these individuals also live in the so-called global south that we saw here. And for examples, emission from the wealthiest 10% and the United States and China led to a 2- to 3-fold increase in heat extremes across vulnerable regions. And this is important attribution in terms of carbon greenhouse gas emissions, given their major role in recent warming. So it is so important that we are able to pinpoint to those culprits of emission and not just have a pan idea of this being the global north, but who in the global north are these individuals that we are specifically targeting. And this is where I would like to offer some empirical insights and, kind of narrowing down this conversation what Jason's been talking about on climate justice, reparations, and neocolonialism in the context of India, where I'm from, and my primary site of research. Because it's important to understand that colonialism did not just extract resources. It institutionalized a global model in which the neocolonial state, and Jason for us really kind of nuanced what the neocolonial state is about, it turns inward to dominate its own population through a westernized instrumental logic, what could be operationalized as development. Because the Indian government, literally, the current government runs on the aspect of what we are calling resource nationalism. It's under the banner of Vikas and Unnati. You go to Bangladesh, you go to India, any of the South Asian countries, the government promises its people to give them development. But what does this development really entail? Now, again, narrowing it further down, because a lot of us here are anthropologists doing ethnographic research. My parents reside in a small urban town in India, but small urban town with population more than that of Norway. And this is a city nestled in the lower Himalayas, which has a seismic zone 5, which means every other day they will experience some tremors. Now, this is undergoing swift urban development. And what is urban development? It means construction of bridges, flyovers, high rises. But what often happens is every time there is flooding, because this is a floodplain which was meant to flood, but what the colonial engineers did, they constructed embankment and completely changed the geography of that region, where now people are no longer able to deal with these floods. And then every time there is a flood, it says, oh, it's because of climate change. No, it is not because of climate change. It is because of the amalgamation of colonialism and capitalism coming together. And that is what is leading to these increased floods. That is what is leading to groundwater depletion. This is what is leading to these urban heat islands, because we have concretized. We don't have green spaces. There are children who are born in India who will probably only live to be 30 because their lungs are choked, because those are the levels of pollution. And why do we need that level of pollution? Because India wants to be a global superpower that wants to be developed. And this is the model of development that these countries are imbibing. And that is that colonial logic. I mean, it's not surprising that a smart city, in its ambitious mission to foster sustainable urban centers through substantial infrastructure infrastructure investment. This was in Guwahati, where I took a local taxi, where the taxi driver said to me a couple of years ago, "Madam, next time you visit, I will be driving an Audi or Mercedes because we will be a smart city. You drive Audi and Mercedes where there are no roads." Of course, that's the kind of empty promise that these structures have given to people. This finally brings me to the idea of which, Jason's been quite in the forefront of it, the idea of reparation, which is fundamental to the achievement of environmental, social, climate justice. However, any attempt at reparation is our response to the uneven ecological exchange, century-long uneven ecological exchange that Jason's been talking about. And this is where the reparations have to be targeted. We are not even talking about it. So Jason talked about the excess death in India. Linked to that is the 1940s Bengal famine that now we know killed 5 million people. There is not even a memorial that stands in the name. And who orchestrated it? It was Churchill. Churchill, who is still hero and the messiah that we talk about. So there are also these global figures that we continue to think are these messiahs of colonialism who continue to be, you go to Belgium, we still have Koning Leopold Strutt. So that's the reality of today. And finally, I would like to also talk about that fundamental to this discussion are issues around mobility, issues around migration, issues around citizenship, and the escape to a better welfarist world. So Jason talked about how there is the north-south disparity, how the labor wages in the global south is so many hundreds of times lower than what you get in the north. But I am someone who came to the north for a better life. I have worked in Norway for 6 years. I do not have a permanent residency, although I have paid taxes for 6 years, which basically means if I lost my job tomorrow, I have 3 months to find another job, or else I'll be deported back to my country, India. So even after paying 6 years of taxes, I am not eligible for unemployment benefit because I am not a global north citizen. Finally, to say that these sociological transformations, these further deepens the kind of inequality that we talk about. We live in an era where we are now selling nature. We are selling nature to save the world. We have commodified nature. We talk about nature-based solution. And these are, you cannot sell nature which is so intrinsic. And this is what, the will to improve, if we go to Tanya Lee or Robert Fletcher's new book that talks about failing forward, that all the solutions, all these global discussions that we have, be it climate summits, be it Convention on Biological Diversity, all of these are made to fail forward. We are not trying to eliminate poverty. We are not trying to do equitable distribution of resources, but this problem solving is geared towards very symbolic and material intervention. And just the last thing I wanted to say was, yesterday, as I was preparing for this, I wanted to look up in Norway something to do with charging stations. And I wanted to see if Equinor had electric vehicle charging station. What came up is Equinor is developing charging stations on the seafloor to charge janitor drones who will be cleaning up the seafloor. That is the level of technological advancements that these corporations are planning, whereas we are in this state where we are talking about the basics that people do not have access to. And this is the gap that we need to fulfill. So thank you so much.
Anwesje, fantastic, thank you. Maria Dievik-Steven, GRIP affiliate, PhD from UAB, specialist on unequal exchange, in fact. No, okay. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here at an event like this that we really need in Bergen, so I'm very happy that you're here. I think your talk really reflected a richness that you can see in your work. And I just wanted to start with some brief comments about why I think your work is so important and the relevance it has for analyzing Norway's place in the world, and then end with some questions that I have, both relating to theoretical orientations and the political implications of your findings. One reason that I think your work is so impactful is that it leaves the listener or the reader simultaneously very angry and very inspired at the same time. And I think being able to pull that off is quite difficult. Angry, obviously, because the injustices are made so abundantly clear. I'm going to repeat one of the figures that you already showed us in your talk, that Southern wages are between 87 and 95% lower than Northern wages for work of equal skill. Now, if this had happened in your local workplace, you would be outraged and you would quit immediately, or at least stage a walkout. Also, the fact that Southern workers contribute 90% of the labor that powers the world economy and receive only 21% of global income. So these are all figures that leave us flabbergasted at the inequalities, and you show that this is about unequal exchange. This is about capitalist appropriation of surplus. Then on the inspiring side of the equation, you also show what you also mentioned in your talk, that we don't need more than 30% of the world's resources and energy to actually provide good lives for 8.5 billion people. So why is this difficult? What are we waiting for? What we need is a radical change of the global economic system. So this brings me to my second point about how your analysis is pertinent to understanding Norway's position within the global political economy. In some of your work, you describe how strong the foundational myth of development is among Western do-gooders. And I think the same applies not only within the development field in Norway, which is quite a big field, but across the political spectrum in terms of how Norway is spoken about as a peace-loving nation, negotiating peace deals and generously financing development projects across the world. The inconvenient fact that we also have a large weapons exports industry somehow doesn't taint this image. Neither does the fact that we sit on the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. While there has been lively debates about the ethical guidelines of the fund, the foundational questions that the position of the fund raises are completely ignored. Being invested in over 8,000 companies across the world, including the worst mining giants, and the genocide and occupation of Palestine, our pension money is precisely created through unequal exchange and through the fact that Southern workers are paid a tiny fraction of what Northern workers are paid for the same skills level. Now you can add to that the fund is generated at the base through producing oil that will also destroy the planet. And despite this, many Norwegian politicians continue to refer to the fund as the most ethical fund in the world. And this also serves to perpetuate the myth that capitalism can somehow be ethical. This myth has really only grown stronger, that Norway is somehow doing good in the world, rather than facing up to the fact that our position within the imperialist capitalist system allows us to shamelessly extract value from the global south, and to moan about the fact that refugees come here and spend all of our tax money. While I believe that any potential for revolutionary change will only ever come from the south, I think it's really necessary to disrupt and burst that myth of Norwegian self-perception as a force for good in the world, which is also quite widespread within academia. Finally, I wanted to close with some questions, and feel free to pick and choose the ones that you want to follow up on. Firstly, in terms of theoretical orientations, your work on unequal exchange obviously stems from dependency theory and wealth system theory, which I really think are theoretical traditions that should be taught to a greater extent in universities, even though they're being slowly revived. But given the importance that you place on colonialism in creating the world economy and contemporary inequalities, as far as I can tell, you don't employ racial capitalism as an analytical tool, nor rely on the black radical tradition. although there are references. I was just wondering about the weighting of theoretical traditions, and also whether you see racism, I know you spoke about it as structural in your talk, but whether you see it as an ideology that's used to justify capitalist exploitation, or how you theorize it. Secondly, what I really find most inspiring in your work is this commitment to thinking about radical change in tangible terms. And one of the very concrete proposals you put forward is following in the footsteps of Samir Min that you talked about, calling for a delinking from the capitalist system. I was wondering if you could talk us through a little bit more what you mean by delinking, and how this ties into achieving economic sovereignty for countries in the global south. And whether you see Trump's extensive tariffs as an opportunity to build South-South production and trading networks, and then also delinking. Just to conclude, you mentioned it towards the end of your talk, and you've also said that what we need is a real progressive alternative, a democratic eco-socialist movement. Obviously, it's a massive question, but I was wondering how you envision such a movement being built in a way that also supports anti-imperialist internationalism, and what we can learn from African revolutionaries in this work. You had Lumumba up there, but I was also thinking about Sankara with his work of delinking and building food sovereignty, for example. And absolutely, towards the end, when you were speaking about how countries in the global south achieved great outcomes in the 50s and 60s, part of that work in the 70s also resulted in this call for a new international economic order, which was obviously squashed by a liberal pushback, as you described. But I'm wondering how you see the opportunities for reviving that, given that there has recently been proposals by the Progressive Internationals and other movements to create a new international economic order. Again, thank you so much for your lecture, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Jason, just 2 short reactions, and then we open the floor for a further conversation.
Okay. Thank you both so much. It was really nice to hear your reflections, which I thought were very rich, and I don't really need to respond. But I'll address the direct questions, at least some of them that you raised. First, about racial capitalism. Yeah, I mean, I tend not to use the term, but the analysis is very central to my thinking. I think Cedric Robinson is very important here. Although my main influences actually come from Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, and most importantly, Sankara, as well as others, but these are central to me. I mean, I grew up in Southern Africa at a time when Pan-Africanist thoughts and liberation struggles were still prominent, and I was influenced by those currents, so they're quite important. To the role of, well, to Norway, I can briefly talk about Norway. I think that there's 2 things to consider, I think, for Norway, right? The first is, why does Norway export fossil fuels in the first place? Like they're digging up fossil fuels not for their own consumption, primarily for exports. Why do you do that? You do it because you need to import things, okay, or you need foreign currency. Now, Norway's not a heavily indebted country, and so does not need to export in order to pay off debts. It needs to export to pay for imports. Now, one way, and this actually is an insight that comes from delinking theory, right? Like one way that you can reduce your pressure for exports is by selectively reducing unnecessary imports, right? So does it make sense to be importing SUVs and new cars, et cetera, and, when you could build public transit systems that are a lot cheaper, a lot less materially and energy intensive, et cetera, by reducing unnecessary imports, including luxury goods, fast fashion, I mean, all sorts of things that are just not required, right? You can avoid having any harm to actual consumption requirements and massively reduce your pressure for exports. So this is one really easy way, actually, to reduce that. Of course, the main question that Norway has to contend with is what to do with all the people who are employed in the oil sector. And this is a question that I'm always engaging with people in Oslo about. And the obvious solution is you establish a public job guarantee that provides an established mechanism for anyone who wants to shift into other forms of production that are more socially and ecologically necessary, right? Even with commensurate wages. Why not? So, this is a very straightforward question. Like, the idea of unemployment is one we have to get past. It's a total artificial scarcity of capitalism, can easily be abolished. You don't have to rely on the fossil fuel sector or any kind of capital to employ workers. Things you want to produce, you can employ workers to do them directly. And Norway has that capacity in a way that most European states don't, right? Because it issues its own national currency. And so the road ahead for Norway is very easy, actually. It's like Norway's a place that could achieve eco-social transition very, very quickly, if it wanted to. So the question is, like, what are the real obstacles, which I assume are primarily political. To the question of, briefly I'll just say, and I guess I'll finish with this, to the question of what can Western leftists do, this is a bit different from what you asked, but I'm going to answer it this way. Because it's true, I think that, if you were to look at the world, it's going to seem apparent that revolutionary transformation in the global south is more likely to drive a transformation within the world economy than anything that occurs in the core states, right? However, this should not be any license for us to sort of sit back and wait for that struggle to occur. And the reason is because of this, and we know this from history. Every time there is a revolutionary struggle or a national liberation movement in the global south, there's brutal imperial backlash against them. Why? Because this is a threat to the way the capital accumulation in the core works. Therefore, if you think that's heinous and want to avoid it, then it's imperative that we build off-ramps for our own economies to achieve post-capitalist transformations, right? And so that when that crunch does come, the supply price rises, growth stagnates, et cetera, then our ruling classes will not be like, the only way to solve this is through genocidal violence, which is their typical response, right? Instead, they can be like, well, in fact, we can transition to a post-capitalist economy, meet human needs at a high standard, improve social outcomes with a lot less requirement for material and energy, et cetera. And so we have to be like building that pathway so that when the crisis comes, we have that option, okay? And about reviving the new international economic order, I do think that there is emerging energy around this, actually. So Progressive International, which I work with sometimes, has been building momentum around this. There was a big summit in Cuba, in Havana, that I attended last year, which brought together political leaders and movements from around the global south around exactly this agenda. There's a lot of energy around it. Why is there energy around it? I think there's two or three main things that have really stimulated this conversation. One is the pandemic. This is actually analysis that I borrow from Progressive International. One is the pandemic, right? Where the global south watched as firms in the global north and states hoarded vaccines, denying access to generic production in the global south, while millions of people died unnecessarily, right? What are you supposed to think when you see that? What are you supposed to think when you see that? This is radicalizing for many people. The same is true of the climate crisis, right? When it becomes apparent to you that as the global north driving this crisis and the consequences fall hardest on the global south, what are you supposed to think about this? When they tell us we're headed for a world of 3 degrees, that's just going to be our policy. Thanks, guys. And you know this is going to cause mass suffering in the global south. What are you supposed to think? This is radicalizing. I think Gaza has also been tremendously radicalizing for the obvious reasons. When it's just apparent that global north states are willing to just completely spit on international law and human rights, in the most ostentatious, spectacular ways, and just expect this is not going to have some kind of reverberation in the world economy, that people are not watching. It's terrible. So I think that these tendencies are also converging, and I think that there will be moves in this direction. Of course, it might not take the form that we want to see exactly, but we see how it plays out and what we can do.
Thank you very much. Clarifying answers. There are questions. Can I see how many questions there are now spontaneously? 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Then we close this round and start with you.
Oh.
And here's the microphone.
Oh, okay. So thank you very much for your lecture. It was very inspiring as always. I'm not sure if I'm a bit off topic. It's just something I would like to hear from you. And that is, what is your sort of opinion or criticism, if there is, on China, their economic model, how they are doing development in Africa, and all of it. I don't have to say the whole thing. I think you know. So I'm just curious, like, what is your take on China? Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting lecture. So, solving this problem of unequal exchange, I think the solution from the perspective of the South that you sort of sketch out is pretty clear: economic sovereignty and independence. But from the global North perspective, so you say that around half of global North consumption, maybe even more in Scandinavian countries, are because of this unequal exchange. At the same time, you say that economic democracy is part of the solution here, but if you ask ordinary people, for example, in Norway or the United States, they'll probably tell you that they think they consume too little. Right? They're probably not even satisfied with this level of consumption. So the implication of solving unequal exchange being that they would have to cut half their consumption, I mean, is it, from the perspective, again, solution is pretty clear from the Southern perspective, but if we're going to contribute from the Northern perspective, how are we going to get people to accept that implication?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. There were two more. All right. Yeah. Going back first, don't forget you.
All right, thanks a lot, Jason. I study system dynamics here at UIB. And we observe events. For example, we could call it a policy, or we could call it global events, but we could call it here in this situation, for example, a policy or a social movement. Underlying these events are always mental models. And I think that's one of these hard things to change. So what do you observe as the mental models underlying what we see today, and then how those mental models would need to change in order for such movements to happen or such policies to be enacted? The second question is related to what you just mentioned about jobs guarantee. How could that be possible in the new paradigm of AI? We know that this boosts efficiency. Should we, or in your opinion, should we embrace these kinds of technologies, and could a solution for that be universal basic income or such?
Thank you.
Thank you. Very educational speech. I represent teacher education, and I am kind of wondering, with all of these movements that are already happening, luckily, I also wonder if, and also reading a little bit about the many projects that you're involved in, I wonder if there is a kind of collaboration towards, I'm representing sort of primary, secondary education, and I'm wondering if there is an idea developing on the role of education in creating these kind of movements, because many of the things that you speak of, unfortunately, is not very present in education, at least I think in a Nordic context. And I have students who have not heard the term neoliberalism. So I think we have a long way to go to recontextualize the many very important insights that are here and these myths that you are demystifying somehow. So I'm wondering if there is a kind of work in terms of getting more of this into education, because I think it's really, really needed. Thank you.
The floor is yours first.
Okay, great, thank you all so much. Let's see, I'll talk a bit about the democracy question, which I think you asked. So, yeah, this question of do people need to consume a lot less, and are they going to agree to do this, et cetera? Like, do they already consume too little? I think this is really important, and I want to emphasize this is actually not what I'm arguing for, in fact. I think that question emerges from a kind of consumption side view of the economy, where it sees it primarily as like overuse of resources is due to consumer demand, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, I don't think that's correct in the way that capitalism works. I think that the excess resource use by the core economies is driven by producers, by capital, right? So consider, again, like fast fashion is a great example. Like a massive overproduction of clothing, and then we're kind of bombarded with advertisements to make us feel dissatisfied with the clothes we have. We have to buy new clothes every few months. I mean, this is like an accelerating treadmill, right? It's wild to see it, actually. This has nothing to do with human needs whatsoever. In fact, most people would be happier if they were not bombarded with those ads and then were more satisfied with the clothes they had. In fact, we know this from empirical research. And so that's an example. Another thing is like, let's say you live in a city that doesn't have public transit. So you depend on the car. So your material and energy use for transport is going to be a lot higher than if you lived in a city that prioritized public transit, where you wouldn't need a car whatsoever, right? And so these are decisions made by producers, made by states. And so I think that like who's on the hook for this is our ruling classes, who are the ones that make those decisions, who control production and make those decisions, right? Another good example is like our phones, right? Like they effectively break down every couple of years. We have to buy new ones. They could very easily be made in a modular kind of way, updatable, upgradable, so that we would very rarely have to replace them. We could still have very high functioning phones, up to date with the newest technology, et cetera, et cetera. But why don't we get phones like that? Because it's not profitable to capital. It's much more profitable to have phones that require replacement. So these are examples of how the profit imperative of capital ends up giving us perverse forms of production. Okay. So when people say they consume too little, they mostly mean like I can't actually afford rents, or I can't I can't afford healthy food, or et cetera, which is true, as I've been pointing out, for vast tracts of people even in the rich countries. But this is not a crisis. This is not because there's, the reason for this is that the goods that they require are not being produced in sufficient quantities and available to people on a decommodified basis. So you can do that, resolve people's sense of economic insecurity, and then scale down unnecessary forms of production, and they won't even notice, in the sense of, do we care if private jet production is scaled down? No, nobody cares about that. We think it's good, probably, right? Cruise ships, yachts, blah, blah. So I think that's the crucial thing. And this is the thing about degrowth people often misunderstand. Degrowth does not call for a reduction in all forms of production. It calls for a reduction in specifically unnecessary forms of production that exist only to facilitate capital accumulation, and calls for an increase in the forms of production that are necessary for human welfare. So this is about overcoming the capitalist law of value and producing differently. Interestingly, we have data from the citizens' assemblies. They've been established in countries all across Europe, right? They're really interesting because these are effectively democratic experiments where people make decisions collectively about economic policy. And what do? They opt for exactly this kind of sufficiency-oriented approach. It's very popular, actually. Something like 94% of people in the citizens' assemblies will opt for sufficiency-oriented economics if given the chance. This is extraordinary. It suggests to me that if we did have economic democracy, this is the kind of policy we would get, right? Because who wants to actively make decisions that we're going to screw the planet and exploit our fellow workers in the global south? Nobody does that, right? Because we're human beings and we care. So I think that actually, like, the empirical evidence is actually quite clear that democracy can promote pro-social and pro-ecological decision-making. To the question of the job guarantee, I still am a big fan of UBI. And I wish that David was here, we could have a discussion about it, because I think that there may be some tensions between us on this question. I've written about it, I've written in favor of UBI, but also I've recently come to understand that I think it's very extremely limited in its ability to help us address our current crises. And the reason is this, okay? So David Graeber was very good at demonstrating that when people have a UBI, they don't just sit on their couches, right? They actually want to contribute to building a better world, and they do. But the problem with UBI is it addresses our consumption deficits, but does not address our ability to produce. Okay, so you may want to build a better world by installing renewable energy capacity or expanding public transit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But can you do that with a UBI? No, because it doesn't give you any access to the materials and training and production capacities that you need. A job guarantee does. It allows people to participate in the projects that they want to participate in, contributing to a better society, which people actively want to do. We also know that a job guarantee is extremely popular. A UBI polls at about 50%. Job guarantee, about 80%, right? So UBI is divisive in ways that the job guarantee is not. So I think that's quite powerful. Now, I would say that it should be implemented together with a UBI so that people can choose. Do you want to do the job guarantee or do you want to take a UBI, right? Why not give people that option? But in an era where there's lots of work we have to be doing to achieve this transformation, then I think you need mechanisms to enable people to do that. And the UBI itself does not, because it doesn't say anything about production. It's purely about consumption, okay? To the question of AI and other forms of labor efficiency improvements, I'm not afraid of this at all. The only reason, I mean, there's other reasons to dislike AI, right? But the only reason that under capitalism we fear labor efficiency improvements, technology development, is because we get unemployed, right? But again, this is an artificial scarcity. If we lived in a normal society, a normal rational society, we would immediately say, okay, so now we have technology to do XYZ jobs, we don't have to do them anymore. We can now do other more important things, right? Like we face a social ecological crisis. We can build out, our public services. We can do ecological regeneration, et cetera, et cetera. Why would we ever be afraid? We're only afraid under conditions where our survival depends on capital choosing to employ us or not. And if they choose not to, we die or we starve or whatever, right? Again, this doesn't have to be this way. We can, there's no limit to our capacity to employ people to do whatever is socially necessary, right? Even if it's not profitable. This is an amazing assumption that people have, amazingly incorrect assumption people have, that production can only occur if it's profitable to do. Lies. Absolute lies. We can produce anything that we want to even if it's not profitable. And we regularly do, by the way. Public health services, not profitable, but we produce them anyways. Roads, not profitable, we produce them anyways, et cetera, et cetera. So that's crucial. To the question, really briefly, of China, and then I'll leave it. People often want to ask about, is China becoming a new imperialist power in Africa? So we did a study on this that's under review right now, which looks at the total drain out of Africa through unequal exchange over the past couple of decades. And what we find is that the core economies are responsible for about 85% of the total drain. China responsible for about 5%, and the rest of the global south for the rest, which means that China's trade relations in terms of unequal exchange with Africa are roughly equivalent to the way that the rest of the global south has relations with Africa. Right? But furthermore, a lot of this is simply because, like China's unequal exchange with Africa, which we do see some of, is largely because they've been improving their price level, which means they passively benefit from a net import of cheaper labor and resources from Africa, which were cheapened not by Chinese interference, but rather by Western interference. And so this is not equivalent to unequal exchange when the country in question is actively engaging to depress prices in the periphery. But furthermore, I think that on the question of imperialism, China has zero military occupation in Africa, has not conducted any genocides in Africa, does not impose structural adjustments on African countries, does not assassinate its leaders, does not coup leaders it doesn't like, does not prop up right-wing dictatorships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, if we're going to start saying that China's behavior in Africa is colonial or imperialist, I think the words lose altogether their meaning, truthfully, right? Now, there may be things that we don't like that China does, like, say, Chinese firms operating in Africa do exploit workers. By the way, according to a recent study, it is no worse, of course, than any other capitalist firm operating there, whether Norwegian or whatever. So what's the problem here is capitalist firms, okay? But that does not amount to colonialism. Otherwise, we're talking about Indian firms or Guatemalan firms operating in Africa also being colonial, which is clearly nonsensical. In terms of China's relationship to its borders, I mean, here too, these are, like, whatever you might say of them, these are disputes over sovereign territory, right? China does not project imperial power around the world in the way the core states do, where the US has 800 military bases around the world, can destroy a liberation movement through bombs at the drop of a hat, can use drones to assassinate leaders. I mean, these are not comparable arrangements. The core states have a monopoly over voting power in the World Bank and the IMF. China does not. So over and over and over again, I think that we lose any real analytical traction when we start using this language. Like, we have to have correct language. If there's something we don't like that China does, then we have to find a better word for it. So for example, border disputes, territorial border disputes, I mean, the same thing is happening between India and Pakistan. Does this amount to colonialism? I mean, I think that that's stretching the term. So I think that we need better, more precise analytical terminology.
Yeah, friends, we're coming to the end of this. I see you all still very sort of puzzled and concentrated. So I feel a little bit rude to stop this. But I have one sort of follow-up question on the China issue that is, I think, too important to leave. And you have just been in China. We've heard you being enthusiastic of what you saw. I've been in China a lot too, and I had the same sort of enthusiasm. What is going on there? Now, when you show the transfer of labor effort from the global south to the global north, this massive contribution that the global south, in terms of bloody labor, is giving to our wealth, then we can assume that China is considered part of the global south. But at the same time, China is sort of leaving the global south and becoming one of its, well, if you don't want to call it imperial, in any case, sort of leaders in a new sort of non-aligned movement. So would you say a couple of words about China and global labor transfers?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sorry, I feel like the China question was actually much more nuanced than I answered. And this helps me.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I was not actually trying to respond directly to that, but rather discourses that are out there.
But it's good that you touched upon that, but my question was not really towards
It was about development policy.
Yes, and even within its own people and the Uyghur people and all the other human rights trespassing that are happening. But I'm aware it's a huge topic.
Yeah,
so,
right, yes.
It's very good, like the way.
Yeah, so the crucial thing is that China is still very much part of the periphery. Its GDP per capita is the same level as the Latin American average right now, right? So it's effectively a semi-peripheral region. Now, it looks to me like it's trying to break from the periphery. I think the next 10 or 20 years will tell us whether that occurs. And by the way, when we see what is happening in China with its attempts to break from the periphery, this is precisely why we're seeing, and I didn't get to talk about this, but precisely why we're seeing an acceleration of saber rattling by Western states against China, right? They used to have a very felicitous relationship up until around 2010. So what happens at this time? Basically, well, there's two things. There's a change in leadership in China, which begins to decisively move in a more socialist direction, right? Decisively move in a more economic sovereignty direction, which freaks out the US. The second thing is that wages start to rise in China really dramatically, with dramatic improvements in labor rights and in wages, right, in bargaining power of workers, to the point where China is no longer a cheap labor economy. Now, Western companies, Western firms, are very thoroughly integrated into China, into the Chinese, independent of the Chinese labor force. This is massively squeezing their profitability. And then the final element, of course, is technological development in China. Because the main element of imperial domination is monopoly over technological goods. So this is how you require the global south to trade with you on uneven terms to obtain technological goods they require. China has been developing its own technologies, breaking Western monopolies. I mean, we can see this all the time happening. Making these technologies available to global south countries so that they can obtain them without trading with the core. This is creating conditions for the rest of the south to delink from imperial dependencies, which is a major threat to the way that capital accumulation works in the world economy. And this is why suddenly, over the past 10 years, there's been this dizzying change where the US ruling class now cannot stop themselves from wanting to go to war with China. And we're bombarded constantly with propaganda toward this end, preparing us to hate China enough that when the war comes, we feel, well, maybe they deserve it, you know. And so I think this is something we have to be able to fight against. Briefly about development policy, because I want to speak about this just for a second. I think that it's interesting to see the way that China has managed to achieve really dramatic improvements in production of renewable energy technologies and capacities, right? They now account for about 80% of all production of renewable technologies. This is extraordinary. And this happened in a very short period of time. How could this have happened when Western capitalists were saying it's not profitable enough to make these investments? Because China has big policy banks which make investments based on national development objectives, regardless of profitability, okay? Which is extremely useful. And this is exactly what I'm suggesting all countries adopt, is policy banks that can direct investments, direct surplus towards necessary forms of production and innovation, because capital is not doing this adequately. So in the West, people are dumbfounded. How did China make this leap towards renewable energy dominance? Well, that's the reason, because they're not subordinated to the capitalist law of value in the same way. Yes, it's a capitalist economy in many respects, with private firms accounting for 70% of GDP, but they also have, party control over the commanding heights of the economy, and importantly, over the direction of finance. And this is something that we can learn from, because the industrial policies that the West have been trying to implement are not working. It boils down to de-risking strategies, right? Where they're saying, we need more investment in renewable energy and electric vehicles, so we're just going to make sure that capitalists can make huge profits in these industries without any risk, okay? It's much more effective to just require investment to flow in this direction. You can achieve your objectives much faster. And I think that we have to just get on board with that reality if we want to achieve the kind of transformation that we want to see.
Jason, I thank you very much. Everybody's excited by what you have taught us. Thank you very much. And thanks again, Rosa Luxemburg. Thanks again, faculty. Thanks again, GRIP. Thanks again, you all.